A Sunday morning in Manhattan, Chambers Street, between Broadway and Church. What was once a quiet residential neighborhood is strictly business now. Little trace of the church that once stood here, or the liberal religion our members helped build 175 years ago. Further uptown and 4 churches later, the religion known as Unitarian Universalism still thrives, preaching its distinctive message of tolerance and religious freedom, governing itself through congregational polity, and stressing the worth and dignity of the individual.
I think it's kind of amazing that a liberal church has survived for 175 years in New York City. When the original people came together to form this church, it was a radical experiment, and I think it's remained so. We don't offer a heavenly insurance policy or a religious security blanket. What we offer is a community, and a community that's engaged helping others and helping ourselves.
It's here in a red brick and sandstone New England-style church located in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side that our Unitarian tradition lives on. The Church of All Souls is our spiritual home, and Forest Church, our spiritual leader.
I think of myself as a spiritual provocateur. I have changed my own views and my own mind many times, and I have the freedom to express that. But the moment I'm surest of something, I doubt it most, and I think that that's probably something that I can help provoke other people to think about.
Hi, I'm fine. Good to see you.
Each week, the congregation is welcomed inside to worship in a largely traditional service, including prayers and hymns. But what sets our denomination apart from others is its respect for spiritual diversity and its challenge to members to find our own truth and meaning. It is a philosophy embedded in the cornerstone of All Souls and reflects the aspirations and achievements of those who have shaped its past. The New York of 1819 was no less chaotic than it is today, only smaller. Tradesmen, merchants, and shipbuilders swarmed along a few square miles of docks, warehouses, and homes that spread north from the Battery along the Broadway. In April of that year, a minister from Boston, William Ellery Channing, was heading to Baltimore to deliver a sermon. Along the way, he stopped in New York to visit his sister Lucy, who had invited friends and neighbors to hear him speak. Channing's words appealed to New Yorkers eager to establish a more liberal church.
He went on to Baltimore, where he preached what is probably the most famous sermon ever preached in America, called Unitarian Christianity. And that sermon is said to have been second only to Tom Paine's Common Sense in distribution in that era. And so when he came back through New York, he was a famous man.
What Channing preached was, and still is, a radical idea.
Unitarian Christianity simply states that the Christianity as it has been passed down to us is filled with wisdom, but it is not dogma. And there is no creed in the Unitarian Church, nor has there ever been. And Channing pretty much straight out said, we are not Trinitarian, we are Unitarian.
The next time Channing spoke, the crowds grew so large that hundreds were turned away. It soon became clear that a place was needed where regular services could be held, and preaching like his could be heard. After nearly 2 years of meeting in rented rooms in public halls, a group comprised mostly of former New Englanders built what was to become the first Unitarian church in New York. It was a small but elegant structure faced with white marble, featuring a window in front made up of small greenish glass panes and a large circular skylight in the center of its roof. At its dedication in 1821, the first church was hailed as a place of refuge, the one spot left on earth where business and pleasure cannot come. William Ware, 24-year-old son of the famous Dr. Henry Ware Sr. of Harvard, was installed as its minister. Better known as a writer than a preacher, Reverend Ware guided the struggling new congregation through 15 turbulent years, surviving a cholera epidemic as well as the Great Fire of 1835 that left much of New York in ruins. He resigned a year later, dissatisfied with his sermons, but many believe it was the miserable living conditions and the death of 2 of his children that led to his departure. About that time, one of the earliest and most active members of Ware's congregation was Catherine Maria Sedgwick.
Catherine Maria Sedgwick was a very important early novelist because she was one of the first to include American history and the American scene into a novel. Up to this time, it had been more on the British model.
Sedgwick went on to become the first American novelist to defend the dignity of the single woman and was an advocate for the rights of all women. Shortly after Reverend Ware resigned, he was replaced by Dr. Charles Theodore Christian Follen, a German refugee and protege of Channing. Follen was considered a fine scholar and capable of drawing a crowd, but some in the church felt alienated by his strident abolitionist ideas, and his thick German accent often made him difficult to understand. Whatever the reason, Follen's ministry was never made permanent, and for 2 years he remained acting minister before leaving the church discouraged. In January of 1840, he lost his life in a tragic accident when the steamship Lexington burned in Long Island Sound. In the fall of 1838, the man who was to become one of the greatest churchmen the Unitarian denomination ever produced, Henry Whitney Bellows, arrived in New York City. Fresh out of divinity school, his first impressions were not favorable. Bellows described New York as a heartless place, but added that, amid all the business and bustle and tear and hustle, there are human hearts, I suppose. Meanwhile, the church Bellows inherited was beginning to fall apart, and in more ways than one. Broadway had been extended to 14th Street, making it easier to reach the farmlands that lay beyond. As members of the congregation moved uptown, attendance went down, and the church fell heavily into debt. The building itself was showing signs of decay. After years of frequent repairs to the roof, a 50-pound section fell to the ground, narrowly missing Reverend Bellows as he was ending a service. Needless to say, a site was soon found for the building of a new church, and in October 1845, the Church of the Divine Unity was inaugurated a few blocks north.
It was a Gothic building that had the flying buttresses and everything, but they didn't fly far enough, so the building couldn't hold up its own roof, and we built this building, but we could never use it.
Over the next few years, the rush to the northern suburbs grew more intense. Downtown New York was fast becoming the scene of riots, begging, and other urban blights, and churchgoers were reluctant to journey south to Broadway and Spring Street. Although the second church was barely 8 years old, the solution for Bellows was to sell the troubled building and move uptown. A new set of lots were purchased on what is now the corner of 20th Street and Park Avenue South, just around the corner from Gramercy Park. And this time, church leaders took their time in selecting an architectural plan. On Christmas Day, 1855, and to the strains of Handel's Messiah, the third church was finally dedicated. Named by Bellows the Church of All Souls, he described the building as religious in structure from cornerstone to dome.
This was Bellows' great church. This was the church that Bellows commanded. He stood in the pulpit without any kind of amplification and boomed out his sermons.
Modeled after a basilica in northern Italy, the third church was of a Romanesque design. Plans originally called for a bell tower, but both funds and time had run out. By using an alternating combination of yellow Italian stone and red brick from Philadelphia, the building was seen by some as a dramatic departure from the city's existing architecture. Others were not so kind.
As soon as they built it, it got these very derisive names: the Church of the Holy Zebra, the Beefsteak Church. In any case, nothing very complimentary was ever said about that church.
It wasn't long before the building was covered top to bottom with ivy. To cover the costs of construction, pews were sold or rented, much as they had been in the two previous churches. This deed to Pew 29 was typical of deeds of that time. The price for a good seat, $700. The building of the third church marked the beginning of what many consider to be the greatest period in the church's history. Among the more prominent members then, Peter Cooper, a local inventor and manufacturer who, despite his lack of formal education, worked closely with Bellows on educational reform. In 1859, Cooper opened the doors to the Cooper Union, offering a free education to men and women regardless of their religious or political beliefs. Dorman Eaton, a prominent New York lawyer who, together with Bellows, set out to reform civil service. New laws he drafted helped crush Boss Tweed and made it easier to fight political corruption in the city. Carolyn Kirkland, a popular writer of fiction about the American frontier, who joined Bellows in founding and editing the Christian Inquirer and organized the Great Metropolitan Fair of 1864. William Cullen Bryant, poet and editor of the Evening Post, who contributed 5 hymns to the church's first hymnal. Nathaniel Currier, who, with his partner Ives, created a new standard of excellence in lithography and printmaking. And Herman Melville, considered one of America's greatest writers, though at the time his novels Moby Dick and Pierre were considered failures. It was a period of great activism and social outreach for All Souls. Then came the Civil War. Within days after the first shots were fired, Bellows preached a fiery sermon in support of the war, saying, "We must wage it in the name of civilization, morality, and religion." Soon, news came back from the battlefield of the intolerable conditions that greeted soldiers. The lack of food and proper uniforms, the lack of first aid for the wounded, the lack of basic sanitation. Bellows and other church members quickly crafted a plan to coordinate the work of existing aid societies into one organization. The group was named the Women's Central Association of Relief, or simply the Women's Central, and Louisa Lee Schuyler was charged with organizing the effort. Schuyler, who would eventually use her skills to found the nation's first professional school of nursing, set up relief headquarters at Cooper Union. Within days, she initiated a massive letter campaign demanding that conditions for the soldiers be changed. When change did not come soon enough, a group led by Bellows went to Washington to present a plan of action. Bellows proposed the creation of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the forerunner to the Red Cross. Its goals were ambitious: to prevent disease in the camps, deliver medical supplies, and feed, treat, and care for soldiers from both sides. After months of deliberations, President Abraham Lincoln approved the idea. Now, all Bellows had to do was raise the money.
Bellows, from my point of view, was an American pragmatist before the word was coined. If you go back and you read the history of the Sanitary Commission, over and over again, it says he was a great leader because he was not an ideologue. His goal was to serve the wounded. And he did what was necessary to reach that goal.
Altogether, Bellows raised nearly $6 million for the commission, while the women of the church continued its work.
And when he came back, even though he had done so much, I think what had happened was that the congregation was empowered, and particularly the women in the congregation, to know how much difference they made and how vital they were.
When the war between the states finally ended, another war was brewing, this time between Unitarians. And once again, Bellows seized the moment.
The denomination would not exist if it were not for All Souls. The Unitarian Church was splitting almost the moment it was founded. We, by definition, are anti-institutionalists who join together and know instinctively only how to do one thing, which is to savage our own institution. And so what he did was he said, look, the people who've been around for some time, the more conservative people, have a lot of ballast in their hold. And the free thinkers have a lot of flight to their wings. And we've got to bring these two groups together and not exclude anyone. And so he established the Ministers Association that held the radical ministers together with the conservative ones, the Western ministers together with the New England ones. So that was the first thing. There's no more important corporate church person in Unitarian history.
In 1882, after 43 years of ministering to the members of All Souls and ultimately the nation, Bellows died. New Yorkers continued to move uptown in droves by the turn of the century, and once again the church followed. Under the ministry of Reverend Minot Simons, plans were drawn to sell the third church, buy property at the corner of 80th Street and Lexington Avenue, and build a new church. The year was 1929, the beginning of the Great Depression.
And the person to whom they had sold the old land went bankrupt. So the church had to assume the mortgage on the old church, which they were no longer occupying. Meanwhile, they were building this church on which they had a mortgage. Meanwhile, they were meeting in a hotel. So they had two mortgages and no place to meet. Enter George F. Baker.
Baker was among the wealthiest of All Souls parishioners, having founded what was to become the nation's largest bank, Citibank. When he died, his son came to the church's rescue by purchasing the old mortgage and helping the congregation pay off the new one.
And the good news about that is that they had absolutely no extra money for gingerbread. When the building was built, the original plan was to have a lot more stained glass and a lot more gewgaws and everything. And in fact, what happened was that they couldn't afford them, so we have a classic and I think, a structure that can last us for a long, long time in utter simplicity and beauty.
On November 13, 1932, the present-day home of the Church of All Souls opened its doors for the first time.
Historically, it reflects our New England roots. You could be in New England on the corner of 80th and Lexington. But there is something more than that. I think that the light, there's a great emphasis on light in the sanctuary.
In many churches, darkness protects the people within the church from the world. In our church, light is sort of clarified and focused, and we see the world, but we also see ourselves in it more clearly. And I think that the brightness of the sanctuary is a part of its beauty.
Since the church was built, its large vaulted sanctuary, tall arched windows, and mahogany-framed pews have resonated with the words of such ministers as Dr. Walter Donald Kring, who wrote a 3-book history of All Souls, and F. Forrester Church, who, like those who came before him, continues to preach Unitarian themes of compassion and service to others. One of our more recent members who exemplified these ideals was Eleanor Clark French. She directed an effort to sponsor rest homes for survivors of concentration camps. Today, All Souls offers one of the largest selections of social outreach programs in the city. They include a Friday soup kitchen for the homeless, a Saturday meal delivery to the elderly, a housing task force for low-income families, a children's task force for disadvantaged children and teens, and an AIDS task force to educate and counsel people with AIDS and their loved ones. Bill Beckman joined the church in response to one of its efforts.
I was riding on a subway and I saw a poster that said, AIDS is a human condition, it requires a humane response. And I was shocked that a church would be affiliated with a poster that said the word AIDS. So that's how I was intrigued, and I came to visit, and I was astonished.
If you take a look at these programs in terms of saving the world one neighbor at a time, we're doing good stuff, and we're doing stuff we have to do. I think that that probably is the most important thing about our church, so long as we don't forget that we must treat one another as kindly as we treat our neighbors.
As the Church of All Souls celebrates its 175th anniversary by honoring its past, it is also looking ahead to the future. Earlier this year, the entire congregation engaged in a comprehensive assessment of the church.
It was just a year ago that we were writing the questionnaire in October. We finalized it in November. We distributed it to the membership in December. We had focus groups in January, and the participation was monumental.
I think the futures process, as exciting and dynamic as it was, upped the ante for us to do better. What we did last year is we invited all thoughts, tried to respond to them, made a number of promises, and now we have to fulfill them.
Despite the fact that there is room for improvement, clearly the Church of All Souls holds a very special place in the lives of its members.
I just think it's a wonderful place that allows us to have a lot of freedom and thoughtfulness and to be together with others that feel that way.
It's very open here, very tolerant. You know, anybody, any belief you have is going to be listened to and accepted.
All Souls to me is a fantastic community of very caring and loving people.
All Souls helps me to be me. I'm not really a traditionalist, so I really feel good about coming here because everybody else isn't.
To the extent that one talks about having an extended family, I have to say that All Souls has been a family to me in a way that few words can describe it.
All Souls is the place where we come when we have troubles and where we come when we have joys to share with other people.
One of the main reasons I come is to get myself back into being more involved in the community and feeling that I'm making a difference or will hopefully help to make a difference in some small way.
All of my dearest friends in the world are here. And so it's a spiritual community. And it nurtures me and it nourishes me and it's home.
The greatest strength of any Unitarian church, and I think particularly ours, is its people honestly expressing themselves and working together to correct what is wrong, affirm what is right, and move forward as best they can. Perfection's not our goal. Our goal is to try to model the kind of community that people who have different beliefs but share the same values can work together, respect one another, and then take their energy to go out into the community and make a small difference in the world. This is the way the world is going to have to be if we're going to be surviving.